the President of the United States and the Prime Minister of the State of Israel.
Thank you very much, everybody. So this is a big day, a beautiful day, potentially one of the great days ever in civilization.
What you just watched were the opening moments from the really historic press conference that was held at the White House recently, jointly, by President Trump and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, where they unveiled the Trump peace proposal for the Middle East. It's a game changer, understatement of the century, maybe millennia, as President Trump would say. And let's get right into it. We have Lieutenant Colonel in Reserves, Jonathan Conricus, Senior FTD Fellow, to unpack it in detail and talk about what we think it might mean for the Middle East. I'm Vivian Bercovici, former Canadian ambassador to Israel. Let's do this. Sunday, October 5th, Lieutenant Colonel Jonathan Conricus in Reserves. Thank you so much for joining State of Tel Aviv today.
Thank you for having me, Vivian.
We have a lot to get through. We had a recent, very dramatic development in the Middle East. President Trump and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu standing together in the White House, holding a joint press conference and announcing to the world that a concrete 21-point peace proposal had been hammered out in the previous days. We seem to think that we have reason to be optimistic, guardedly. What's in the plan and what does it mean?
Yeah, so I think there's room for cautious optimism because this presidential plan, unlike the first Trump vision over Gaza, which entailed moving the population out, rebuilding it, moving the population back in, and creating a Singapore on the Mediterranean, that was undercooked, diplomatically speaking, did not have regional or international buy-in. None of the important stakeholders were happy to support it. And even though that plan may have been a better plan for the future of Gaza, it doesn't matter because it was dead on arrival, more or less, and didn't do anything. This plan that the president just unveiled is pretty well prepared, and there's been a lot of diplomatic legwork being done behind the scenes by President Trump himself and, most importantly, his team, Kushner and many others that have been part of really building an alliance here. And I think very importantly, getting Sunni Arab states and Turkey on board and having their support, in addition to Indonesia and Pakistan and other Muslim countries that are now for the first time saying openly to Hamas that Hamas, we do not want you to govern Gaza in the future. We want you to return the hostages. We want you, Hamas, to disarm, and that the control over Gaza should be handed over to an international body, a force, a bit ambiguous, and then eventually be handed over to Palestinian technocrats for self-governance. That's the gist of the program, and I think very importantly, it has Arab support, European support, and President Trump, I think, has Prime Minister Netanyahu exactly where he wants him, because Israel, to be frank, does not have any other meaningful strategic partner, and what President Trump says goes. And I, as an Israeli, I'm pretty happy with the plan. I think that it provides a lot of the security assurances that are needed, and it creates the chances for a better future for Israelis and for Arabs in Gaza. So I have no major issues with the plan, but this government under Prime Minister Netanyahu has kind of found itself now in a situation where it's Trump's way or the highway with very little wiggle room, and that isn't necessarily a positive thing at all. But if we look at the plan, we have the core tenets of it, which says all of the hostages, 48 live and dead, are to be released within 72 hours of an agreed upon ceasefire. Israeli troops will start to withdraw, and the President Trump yesterday tweeted a map with lines of withdrawal that he claims, we haven't had that really corroborated by Israel, but that he claims, and I believe him, it was approved and agreed on by Israel, where there's different lines in Gaza where Israeli troops will withdraw, eventually leaving the Gaza Strip after hostages are returned successfully and completely, still not clear, but for a thin perimeter or thin buffer zone along the borders, including the border between the Gaza Strip and Egypt, the Philadelphia corridor, and a buffer zone along the border between the Gaza Strip and Israel, basically from Kerem Shalom in the south to the Mediterranean Sea in the northeast. Then the important part, which is still, it's a statement, but there's still no flesh on the bone, is that the Gaza Strip will be de-radicalized. Now, you can read into that many things, and I'm sure many people and organizations and institutions will read different things into that the Gaza Strip will be de-radicalized, and we can expand about that in a second. But then Hamas will be forced to disarm and lay down their weapons. They will have the ability to get a safe exit from the Gaza Strip if they choose to leave and evacuate the Gaza Strip, and they won't be persecuted or harmed as they are surrendering. And then that Hamas will not control the Gaza Strip in the future, but that an international board of peace, as the president dubbed it, will oversee events, and that local Palestinian and Arab and international technocrats will manage the Gaza Strip until it is ready enough to manage itself. Important to emphasize, the Palestinian Authority has not been mentioned by name, and I think that is not an oversight or a mistake. I think that is by intention, whereby the Trump plan doesn't say that the control over Gaza will be handed over to the Palestinian Authority. That's kind of a red flag for Israel. I think Israel definitely doesn't want the PA in control over areas A and B in Judea and Samaria or the West Bank and the Gaza Strip after the war. And I think Israel, specifically this government, will fight that tooth and nail. But some kind of self-governance, just to emphasize and clarify, no annexation of land in Gaza, no mention of, and specifically, I think, mentioned that it wouldn't happen. Nobody has to leave Gaza, no forced removal or migration. And from my point of view, also regretfully, no mention of the fact that people who would want to leave the Gaza Strip would be able to do so through Egypt. So those are the tenets, and we can discuss different parts of it. Agreed upon by Israel, and as we're speaking, additional pressure, verbal pressure applied by President Trump, whereby he tweeted and said on CNN, we will see how serious Hamas are. If they're serious, they will release hostages. If no, they will face very severe consequences. And I think he knows pretty well that Hamas will try to play for time. They will try to use the hostages as that shiny object that is so coveted and so emotionally connected for us Israelis, and I think for the president himself and many, many decent human beings around the world. Hamas is basically saying, okay, we're showing here that we're serious, and we commit to returning the hostages with a few conditions and technical situation on the ground, but they understand that they have to give over the hostages and they want to negotiate the rest. But President Trump is saying this is not going to be a long, protracted negotiation. We're not going to have Iranian-style diplomacy and draw out things. This is going to be short and dirty and to the point where Hamas surrenders, hands over their weapons, and vacate the premises being Gaza.
So let me jump in there because there's an awful lot in there. And what I'd like to do is just go back to that Friday, about 10 days ago. Friday morning, I was in Toronto at the time, actually watching it live. Prime Minister Netanyahu's speech to the UN General Assembly, when most members of the UN got up. It was a coordinated stunt by the Palestinian delegation. We've seen the letter they sent around. Most of the world got up and walked out, and he spoke to a near empty hall. Yes, theatrics and doesn't really mean a lot legally, but also very meaningful because what it did was demonstrate very visually how isolated Israel has become diplomatically. And even the countries that remained in the hall, among them my other home country, Canada, did so while gritting teeth. Our ambassador to the United Nations, Bob Ray, said, well, yeah, I stayed because it's my job to listen. So that was a very grudging kind of, concession. But we had just come through a week of recognition, unconditional recognition by many Western states, led by Prime Minister Mark Carney of Canada, unconditional recognition of the state of Palestine. It's like, enough, we've had it, we can't deal with Netanyahu. And it is a very personal issue for many of these leaders. So we're just going to recognize Palestine and be done with it. That was on Friday. It was over the weekend that it seems a lot of activity was undertaken by the White House. And it was, I believe, the following Monday when President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu took to the dais in the White House to present this peace proposal to the world. And you've very thoroughly outlined the major tenets and points of that plan. But now what I want to do is start kind of going at some of the layers. Here are some of the initial rough spots. In your introduction or your comment, you didn't mention Qatar. You mentioned Turkey, a number of other countries. Qatar obviously is critical. And President Trump is being very complimentary and solicitous of the Emir of Qatar. What a great friend, just like President Erdogan of Turkey. But the fact is that Qatar started out saying, we support this plan with other Arab nations in the region. And that, of course, came after Prime Minister Netanyahu read a scripted apology to the Emir for the September 9th air attack on Hamas headquarters in Doha. So that apology is read, it's filmed, the Emir says, okay, I'll sign on, I'll back the plan, and they go and have their press conference. Within 24 hours of that, the Emir of Qatar was starting to kind of wobble. And, well, maybe we don't have to completely defang Hamas, and maybe this isn't so fantastic. A number of Arab countries have come out highly critical of President Trump's suggestion that to former UK Prime Minister Tony Blair, who has a long and deep history of diplomacy in the region, that Tony Blair is the right guy to run this thing. Yes, President Trump will be the de facto chair of the board, so to speak, which signals his seriousness of intention and following through and keeping an eye on things. And nobody wants Trump kind of hollering down the phone and wagging his finger at them. But Tony Blair would be the day-to-day point man. And my understanding is there's significant mistrust of Sir Tony Blair in the Arab world. So what I'd like to do now, before we even get to the hostage issue, which is about to hit a snag, can you comment on that? On Qatar's role and Sir Tony Blair's role?
Yeah. So before that, I think quite a remarkable turn of events under and thanks to President Trump, who he didn't undo the French, Canadian, British, Australian, horrible Portuguese and others, but those were the four important countries. He didn't really undo their silly, naive, reckless recognition of a Palestinian state, but I think he dialed it back and he poured a big bucket of reality, cold, hard reality over that silly diplomatic endeavor. And I think that's how it's going to remain for the foreseeable future as well. That was interesting to see. Second observation, Qatar, yes, just to be clear, Qatar is a state sponsor of terrorism. Qatar supports Hamas financially and politically. Qatar harbors, aids, and abets ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and the Taliban. Qatar is, I think they probably should be recognized as writing the book, or at least adding the most recent chapters in influence operations and soft power by a small country. And I think they are now getting return on investment with interest with the investments that they have made in buying hearts and minds in the West, specifically in the US, DC, but not only. And in addition to what you said, in that humiliating moment where the Israeli prime minister had to apologize to a terror supporting country for attacking terrorists that they were harboring, it's an absurdity. And I have some pity for Netanyahu that he had to do it. I think he had very little choice. And that goes back to the beginning of what I reflected on, how reliant Israel has become under Prime Minister Netanyahu on Trump as the sole international ally and supporter. And Trump was adamant because Qatar was adamant. In addition to that, to add another insult to injury, or injury to insult actually, was that President Trump declared that he now ordered not a defense treaty, but basically under the powers vested in him, a presidential decree where the U.S. will de facto defend Qatar more than they've done before and make sure that nobody violates their airspace or their sovereignty, and even including putting U.S. assets, men and women, in the line of fire in order to do so. Unprecedented. I'm sure the Saudis are very envious because that is something that the Saudis have been asking for, dreaming of for a long time. And the Qataris landed it allegedly without really giving anything in return. What I think is being given in return is Qatari support of the Trump ceasefire or peace deal, and that they're giving up or cutting loose Hamas and basically supporting what President Trump is saying, returning all the hostages, disarming Hamas, and kicking Hamas out of running the Gaza Strip in the future. So strategically speaking, that is not good because Qatar is a very bad, nefarious country that supports terrorism, that instigates violence, that has a very important role in the distribution of radical Islam, Muslim Brotherhood through Al Jazeera, their TV mega organization, media empire Al Jazeera, which is everywhere. And of course, through their buying of people, institutions, universities, political parties, museums, education, and everything else that they can buy with their tremendous wealth in the West. So that is not a good development, a strengthening of Qatar, security assurances for them. That's not a good situation. About Sir Tony Blair, yeah, I can understand why Arabs have an issue because Sir Tony Blair is positive towards Israel. He doesn't hate Israel. I think he actually is slightly fond of Israel and is sympathetic towards the Zionist endeavor. And I can understand why Arabs and Israel haters would have a problem with him. And I'm sure that they would have wanted to have a Starmer or a Macron or a Carney leading that situation. And I'm sure that they would find someone much more hospitable to Hamas's demands in any of those three gentlemen that I named. But that isn't it. And Trump has decided that it's Sir Tony Blair. He's a talented and experienced diplomat and former head of state. I think he'll be able to manage. But like with everything else with President Trump, if it doesn't work, he will be replaced and the process will continue. And President Trump is extremely result-oriented. And to follow up to that, I think we have to recognize that there is presidential, political, personal prestige on the line here. The President Trump is putting a lot of his personal presidential capital on the line. He is jeopardizing quite a lot, and this needs to work. And I think that the president will do everything that needs to be done to get down and dirty and to get his hands into the action in order to see this through. And I think that's what's needed, because otherwise Hamas will wiggle around and maybe even Israel won't be 100% committed unless it's a president who is really pushing it personally and seeing it through as the chairman of the board, but really vested in it. And I think that's a good place for this to be. Now, there's one point that I do want to address here in terms of the actual details of the plan, and that is deradicalization. And I think this is the part that is the most important for the future, the one that has the longest influence and strategic bearing, that I fear will be underthought and not given enough attention, and eventually that will fail. Now, in my mind, Gaza, and many people would, I think, scholars and experts would agree, Gaza has a history of being the least educated, the most underdeveloped, and with the highest levels of unemployment, illiteracy, religious fanaticism, and natural support for the Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas. No other place in the Middle East is as bad as Gaza. And if Gaza is to be de-radicalized, then there are two systems that I believe need to be totally overhauled and revolutionized. One is the education system in Gaza, and two are the mosques. Now, the education system is run, 90% is run by UNRWA. Canadian, American, a little bit less American, but Canadian, European, Japanese taxpayers' money are funding a system that is basically a conveyor belt or an assembly line for the next generation of jihadists. I'm not being blunt and I'm not simplifying it. This is what UNRWA is. It is a system that indoctrinates young Arab men and young Arab boys and girls into believing that soon, just around the corner, they're going to return to Palestine, and that if they can't, then to die a glorious death as a martyr is the most benign and best goal that they can ever dream of doing as a shaheed. UNRWA has to be dismantled. UNRWA has to be kicked out of the Gaza Strip. And if that doesn't happen, then I think we're going to revisit or face the consequences of a radical Gaza in 5 years, 10 years, and we will be facing some other jihadi abomination. If it isn't Hamas, then it's ISIS, and if it isn't ISIS, then it's something else just around the corner. But the bottom line is that if we don't address UNRWA, and if we don't address the mosques in Gaza, the situation will persist. It'll continue to be a radical extremist society that is hate-filled, anti-Semitic, and terror-supporting, which is what, in general terms, Gazan society is today. And if we want to change it, we, collectively, US, Arab countries, and of course, Israel, need to change it. And the first order of business should be get rid of UNRWA.
So I couldn't agree more. But before we get there to the dismantling, deconstruction of UNRWA, which obviously is going to engage the United Nations system as a whole, I want to mention a few points, and then I want to dive into the first issue that is going to cause challenges, which is the release of the hostages. As you mentioned, the Gaza population is particularly radicalized, less educated, less sophisticated, deeply religious in the Muslim Brotherhood kind of Islamist, fundamentalist, I'm going to say fanatic way. It's also important for our listeners to understand that I believe it's just under half of the population of Gaza, which is around 2.1 million today, are under the age of 20, meaning that they really have no experience of having existed with Israel in even a remotely normal way. So, before Hamas came into power, before Israel withdrew unilaterally from the Gaza Strip, there was much freer movement across the border between the Gaza Strip and Israel.
Yep.
Many people from the Gaza Strip worked in Israeli businesses, farms, homes, and children would also have been exposed to something other than IDF soldiers in the course of a war. So when we've heard this over and over from hostages who have been released, that when they were left alone, I think Ali Sharabi was saying this most recently on his book tour, he was really fearful when they were left alone with the younger guards because they were the cruelest, meanest, most sadistic. The older ones tended to have a little more compassion.
Yeah, compassion is a big word for Hamas terrorists. Yeah, but yeah, he was less afraid of them. But I also remember that Eli Sharabi wrote and said that he was, and I read his book, and I recommend everybody should read it. He also said that he was the most afraid, and the Hamas guys were afraid that the ordinary Palestinian civilians, the same people
Yes.
that the world is crying rivers of crocodile tears over their situation and humanitarian aid and well-being and whatnot, those same people were the main cause of fear and concern, even for the Hamas captors. And when Eli had to relocate from one tunnel to another with the Hamas terrorists who were forcing him, they were really on edge because they knew that if the mob, ordinary Palestinians, Gazans, would see an Israeli hostage, they would lynch him. And that really tells you so much about the state of affairs and how deep, how animalistic the hatred is towards Jews and Israelis. It goes way beyond, I think, anything that our listeners can comprehend in Canada or in the US or UK, where that kind of behavior, maybe our grandfathers encountered it in the Second World War. But other than that, most people, if they haven't been on the battlefield and if they're not in Israel dealing with jihadi terrorists, they haven't encountered that kind of hatred and thinking. But that is what Israeli hostages faced, and that is what Israelis faced, and that is, by the way, what we saw on October the 7th, when out of the 5,000 Palestinians who invaded into Israel, 3,000 were Hamas, the rest were Palestinian civilians who came in, raped, plundered, beheaded, burned, stole, and did everything else that they could, just because they could.
And then the others who didn't come into Israel but remained in the Gaza Strip, once the hostages were paraded through the streets, they joined in the
Lynchings.
Exactly. And it's something that we've heard echoed from every single hostage who has been released. Even the initial group of women and children, November 2023, women and children in vans, in Red Cross vehicles, were most terrified of being lynched during the release because of the mobs throwing things, banging on the windows, rocking the vehicles. And we've, of course, seen some video footage of that as well. I want to get to the hostages, but before that, again, two quick comments. One is Prime Minister Carney, Macron, Starmer. I actually think that they took a bit of a licking as well publicly, because the response to the Trump peace proposal and the fact that he had worked to assemble a very impressive lineup of states supporting the proposal, including basically all of the states in the Middle East, other than Iran, but the key states, and Israel, and America was backing it. Whereas the Carney, Starmer, Macron escapade basically had the support of Abbas, who Carney had spoken to for 1 hour in July, and they negotiated terms. He put out a 2-paragraph press release and said, okay, problem solved.
Serious diplomatic work. Wow.
Exactly. They have all had to walk back their initial position quite significantly, and I think that they're going to sit in the back row for a while. But Trump, the first test is now. And we know tomorrow everybody is meeting in Cairo to get down to brass tacks on the hostages. President Trump has made it absolutely clear. He's unequivocal and emphatic. They all have to be released now. And he's not waiting. He's not doing stages. I want all 48 out at the same time. And if you don't do it, I believe today he used the word obliterate with respect to what may happen to the Gaza Strip. And so he and
Hamas,
Rubio are kind of engaged in this interesting kind of, good cop, bad cop sometimes throughout the course of today. They have been. Bottom line is they've made it very clear. That's going to happen. And that's going to happen before the other terms are negotiated and finalized. We're not going to keep them there while we dot I's and cross T's. We also, those of us who pay close attention, have heard and won't be surprised if we learn that Hamas comes to the table and says, oh, by the way, of the 20 hostages who you believe to be alive, we can only locate however many, 18, 17, 16. Of the 28 bodies of Israelis and others who have been murdered in captivity, we can only find however many. The likelihood of them coming forward and saying, great, we've got all of the 20 living hostages, we know where they are, we can produce them, and we have the 28 bodies remains, and we can produce them within 72 hours max. There have already been rumblings from both Qatar and Hamas through Qatar, not happening. We think it's a remote possibility. Comment, if you would, on what you think about that, because if that turns out to be the case, and even if they do have all of the hostages and remains, it would be such a Hamas trick to, come to the table just to put Israel in the squeeze, right? To
Yeah.
continue the psychological torture and see how far they can go. But this is a situation, let's presume, that Israeli negotiators are going to be met with in the next 24 hours.
Yes. And I think, I think you're right in the assessment. That is what Hamas and their supporters, Qatar, will try to do, to draw out negotiations, to stall, to waste time. It's, from the Iranian textbook of negotiations, but maybe a little bit more crude and less sophisticated, and not in long phrased statements like the Iranians, who pontificate about international law as they are developing nuclear weapons, but that'll be the gist of it. Now, what I think is positive is that President Trump is already indicating that he's on to that. He understands that is what they will try to do, and he's not going to have it. Now, what will be interesting is, okay, which tools will President Trump use, and what will he authorize Israel to do in order to apply pressure for Hamas to actually deliver all the hostages? I do not know, and I'm not sure that anybody knows, as in not assesses, but knows, if Hamas really has any issues with locating hostages or remains. If we look at the past, we've seen that they at least once, when they delivered the body of Yarden Bivas, the mother of the two Bivas boys, they returned another body of a Palestinian woman, which then Israel sent to forensic analysis, promptly said, this is not her, return the remains of murdered Shiri, the mother of the two Bivas boys, but mother Shiri and the two boys were murdered by Hamas. And when Hamas returned the body, they returned the wrong body. So that's one incident where we've seen they've had difficulties. Whether that was an additional trick in cruelty by Hamas or genuine mistake, I don't know. But, reason stands that Hamas has had enough time, and that this is the most important asset that Hamas has for its own survival of what's left of Hamas. And it would be reasonable to think that they do, in fact, have control and access to all of the hostages, those that have been murdered and those that definitely the ones that are alive. And I wouldn't buy any of the Hamas or Qatari attempts to create, false pretense of as if they don't. Other terrorist organizations, civilians, or whatever lies they will come up with. It doesn't make sense, because these are two important assets. And I remember, again, reading Eli Sharabi's book and then listening to testimonies of other Israeli hostages that were released. Hamas was focused in terms of the chain of command, leadership, etc. They were focused on this asset that they abducted, these hostages that they abducted. And I don't think that 2 years have passed and they've, misplaced them, or that they have become less important in the eyes of Hamas and therefore not accessible. On the contrary, the longer time goes by, the more important they are for Hamas, and therefore I don't think it is reasonable that Hamas should claim that they have difficulties locating them. I think that's just a tactic, a delaying tactic, and I hope that Trump will call their bluff and force them to hand over all the hostages, dead and alive.
Just for our listeners, Eli Sharabi's book, which is, I understand, a very powerful memoir of his time in captivity. And he gets into, of course, some of his experiences since he's been released. It has been out in Hebrew for a couple of months, I believe. And on Tuesday, 2 days from today, it will be published in English. So you can do your pre-orders. And I'm told by many people that it is very well worth the read, very much so. I want to just try to pull together a lot of other parts of this peace proposal. Let's assume that one way or another, we get past the hostage issue and they are released. And we all desperately want that to be the case in the coming days. And then the negotiators are going to have to drill down quickly and effectively into all of the other issues that sit there. We've talked a bit about deradicalization, but I want to hear from you on a few others that Hamas and Qatar have already begun to push back on. Well, you can't tell Hamas to disarm. Maybe Hamas says we need to hang on to defensive weapons, not offensive weapons. You can't say that Hamas cannot remain a governing force in any way in the Gaza Strip. And there have been a number of other kind of points on which Hamas and Qatar have pushed back and said this just isn't on, you're going too far. Again, what's your read? Because to me, those are non-negotiables for President Trump.
Well, everything is negotiable, some more than other points. But bottom line, I think these are crucial for Israel and they are crucial for the future. And if they're not achieved, then I don't think Israel can say, well, we're okay. This is a compromise that we're willing to live with and actually end the war, whether we get hostages or don't get hostages. The future and Hamas's stake in it is something that I think is really pivotal to the security of the state of Israel, the security of Israelis, and I don't think Israel is going to compromise on it as far as it can influence things. Of course, Hamas doesn't like it, and of course, the Qataris, their supporters and bankrollers don't like it, and of course, the Iranians and Hezbollah don't like it, and I can understand them, but let's remind them of reality. They are losing a war, they are losing on the ground. The only area that they're ahead is international public opinion, except for in the US. And yes, we've seen all of these, the swell of support for Hamas and people waving Palestinian flags in the US, Canada, Europe, and Australia, and many other places. We've seen demonstrations. So that is a place where they've been successful. But other than that, they are losing. They've lost most of their infrastructure. They've lost most of their assets, most of their key personnel. Rank and file soldiers or terrorists, yes, there are new recruits that have filled the void. But in terms of real strategic capabilities, they have lost a lot and they will continue to lose more if the war continues. And when you're losing, you don't get to dictate terms. When you win, you get to dictate terms, and Hamas is not winning. So whether they like it or not, whether they agree with it or not, that is a reality that Israel has to force them to recognize. And I hope and I believe that President Trump will see that through. And hopefully, and again, a lot here hinges on exactly how conducive and positive Qatar will be when it comes to actually cutting Hamas loose. And it'll be a difficult thing for them to do because Hamas is the tip of the spear of the Muslim Brotherhood's exporting efforts, expeditionary efforts. And Qatar is a Muslim Brotherhood state, cloaked in fancy clothes and with a lot of money and sophisticated media, etc. But the bottom line of Qatar is Muslim Brotherhood and Islamic revolution around the world. That is why they're buying influence. That is why they are promoting terrorist organizations, Sunni jihadi terrorist organizations. So, of course, they don't want the main standard bearer, current standard bearer of Muslim Brotherhood and radical Sunni Islam to be undone. But here again, the tension or the balance of power between the US president, Israel, and Qatar, we'll see how that plays out. I understand that they don't want to do it, but the issue here will be to force them to do so. Where is there wiggle room and more flexibility? If we're honest, I don't think that even the IDF's intel officer responsible for, knowing everything there is to know about Hamas's military capabilities, even if he were hard-pressed, I don't think he would be able to say exactly how many AK-47s and how many rounds of ammunition Hamas has today. So the whole disarmament, I think it'll be much more declarative and maybe for the cameras. But to think that, all the weapons in the hands of Hamas will be handed over, That's obviously not going to happen because we don't know how many there are, and because we know for certain that Hamas will do everything they can in order not to hand over the weapons. What's easier to measure? Production facilities of rockets, tunnel building capabilities, finances in terms of the research and development funds, and tunnel infrastructure. Those are things
Right.
that are more tangible, that can be quantified and measured and monitored to a little bit better extent. But to go high resolution and AK-47s and 7.62 rounds of ammunition, that isn't going to be successful.
So, just to wrap, in all of that, which is quite a bag of snakes, I think that we would probably agree that the only real leverage that Israel has in this scenario is the fact that militarily it's far stronger than Hamas, and that we've now isolated Hamas in this very small area in Gaza City where we have one opening left for civilians who want to leave, but otherwise the noose is becoming very tight around Hamas. So it's shaping up to be quite a battle if this peace proposal is not negotiated. And the other, I suppose, bit of leverage that Israel has is the support of the United States. Do you agree?
Yeah, I would add to that there's growing discontent inside Gaza, and clans, extended families, are teaming up against Hamas, taking quite drastic measures, including using violence to defend themselves and to attack Hamas. We've had more than 25 elite Hamas terrorists killed by clans in Khan Yunis a few days ago, officially, publicly recognized by those clans, and with the statement against Hamas saying, your days are over. And we, 5 important clans in Khan Yunis, we're not going to continue to tolerate you. That's one. Many times underreported and underestimated, but the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation has been rivaling the UN Hamas distribution network of goods and services, specifically food, and has already provided more than 180 million meals in the last 3 or so months to people in Gaza. And they continue to be on the ground. They continue to expand their operations as Gazans from Gaza City have evacuated and heeded warnings and made their way to the south. They have now also come under and been enjoying the services of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, and the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation is scaling up. That is a strategic threat to Hamas and UNRWA because Hamas relies on having control over food and international aid that comes in through its front organization, UNRWA. And that's the second thing that is very important, and I really hope that Israeli and American leaders will have the strategic wisdom and vision to keep the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation on the ground, to make sure that they're funded and protected, and to have them continue to provide food for those who need it in Gaza, and not to allow the reestablishment of the corrupt and Hamas-supporting UNRWA channel of provision. And that's the second topic. Third topic, yes, under President Trump, when he was elected, that was a game changer. Had he not been elected, I think the war would have ended many months ago, and it would have ended with the US and the international community forcing Israel to take the dictates of Hamas, whereby Hamas would have been able to hold on to hostages and release a few in drips and drabs and extend the situation. And Hamas would have been able to use the leverage their abuse of Palestinian civilians, their use of human shields, and the humanitarian situation. They would have been able to leverage that into enough international pressure on Israel, and Israel would have been forced to stop. The only thing standing between that and reality is President Donald Trump, and he changed that. And with his current peace plan, he's actually really turning the tide on that. And that's something that I think we cannot underestimate and we should be very mindful of. Bottom line, we're in the early stages of, I think, a new chapter. It's uncharted. Hamas is on the back foot. Israel has the ability to achieve most of its goals. I hope that the US president will be steadfast and apply pressure on Qatar, which will then apply pressure on Hamas to actually hand over the hostages and then disarm and vacate the Gaza Strip for the sake of Gaza and the people who live there. And that Israel will have the discipline, vision, and leadership to make sure that sentence of de-radicalizing Gaza means kicking out UNRWA, relegating them to the dustbin and the eternal corner of shame of the world for the horrible indoctrination of Palestinians that they have done and being facilitators for Hamas and overhauling the mosque systems. And if that doesn't happen, we'll get our hostages back, hopefully, but we will find ourselves fighting Gazans again in a few years. And I really hope that is not what's in us for the future.
Well, amen to that, but I do think I'm of the view that the hostage issue is going to make or break this whole process. Hamas has to deliver on that. It gives Prime Minister Netanyahu a very easy out. And in my view, that would be really unfortunate. So it's going to be a bit of a nail biter for the next few days. And I agree with you totally on the de-radicalization, get rid of UNRWA and many other UN organizations that operate in the Gaza Strip currently with humanitarian agendas. They have to be replaced, and it's going to have to be something, like the Marshall Plan that was introduced to lead the denazification and rebuilding and rehabilitation in every way of Nazi Germany after World War II. We have a very similar kind of problem here. It's going to take tremendous work, and if anyone can do this and bring it home, I think that President Trump can, so let's hope it's successful. Thank you so much, as always, for your time, your insights, your wisdom, and I'm sure we'll both be paying very close attention to what transpires in the next couple of days.
Thank you, Vivian. We will be paying attention and praying. I'm sure both of us will, together with Am Yisrael all over the world and good people all over the world, for the safe return of the hostages, those that are alive to their families, for the long journey of healing, and those that are dead for proper burial so that their families will have closure.
Amen. Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you, Vivian.
Thanks for joining us today. I hope you feel more informed, better informed about what's going on the ground and what may transpire in the coming days. Thanks for being here.
We love hearing from you, so please comment on our website, stateoftelaviv.com, or send us a note to hello@stateoftelaviv.com. On behalf of the State of Tel Aviv core team, Jan Szabo, our creative, graphic, visual, and marketing man, Amir White, producer and editor extraordinaire, sound guy who is also impressively patient with me and my boomer tech deficiencies, and our social media manager who pitches in on everything, Maya Naftalin. Thanks to the team. Thanks to you for being here. We'll be back soon.